A history of the world, as distinct from a history of the unrepresented, must clearly be a history of phenomena, that is, a history of collective representations. It will be well to consider briefly the bearing of this truth on what is sometimes called prehistory. I mean in particular the history of the earth before the appearance on it of human beings. When particles of rain, rays of light, and our watching eye are appropriately disposed, we see a rainbow. In the same way, given the existence of the particles and the presence of human beings on the earth, there arise collective representations, or in other words, the phenomena, which we call nature. When dealing with times in which these conditions were present, therefore, it is quite reasonable to describe and investigate nature scientifically, not only in the manner of physics, but also in the manner of the sciences whose field of study is the past as well as the present, such as geology, ecology, zoology, and to do so as if the phenomena were wholly independent of man's sensory and psychological participation. It is not necessarily misleading to do so, and it has proved to be of great practical use. It is, however, not sufficiently realized that different considerations apply to any description, in familiar terms, of natural events and processes deemed to have taken place before the appearance of human life on the earth. Yet, by combining, say, biology and geology, and omitting physics and physiology, such descriptions are continually offered to us, and form, I suppose, a recognized part of our education. It can do no harm to recall occasionally that the prehistoric evolution of the Earth, as it is described, for example, in the early chapters of H.G. Wells's Outline of History, was not merely never seen. It never occurred. Something, no doubt, occurred, and what is really being propounded by such popular writers is this: that at that time the unrepresented was behaving in such a way that, if human beings, with the collective representations characteristic of the last few centuries of Western civilization, had been there, the things described would also have been there. This is not quite the same thing. It needs, I should have thought, to be considered in connection with another fact, namely, that when attention is expressly directed to the history of the unrepresented, as in calculations of the age of the Earth based on radioactivity, it is invariably assumed that the behavior of the unrepresented has remained fundamentally unchanged. Moreover, and this is to my mind more important, for those hypothetical human beings with the collective representations characteristic of ours, we might choose to substitute other human beings, those, for instance, who lived thousands of years ago. We should then have to write a different prehistory altogether. And we are not entitled to assume, without inquiry, that, as an indirect means of suggesting the truth about the prehistoric goings-on in the unrepresented, such an alternative model would be any less efficient than the one we have in fact chosen. It might be very much more so. As these consequences may be startling enough to the reader to cause her to reject them, even though she has so far followed me with sympathy, I will, at the risk of repeating myself, put as clearly as I can the alternatives to accepting them. If we refuse to accept them, we can adopt one of three courses, to each of which there are, to me, insuperable objections. We can adopt a sort of super-naive realism, rejecting all the rigmarole of physics, physiology, and psychology, with the healthy instinct of Dr. Johnson kicking his stone. Nature is nature, and the earth is the earth, and always has been since it all began. This may do for the present moment, but for a scientifically reconstructed prehistoric past, it is open to the objection that, if we are going to reject the reasoned inferences of one set of scientists, there seems no particular reason why we should accept those of another. Or we can resort frankly to doublethink. We can think that what physics tells us is true when we are studying physics, and untrue when we are studying something else. The objections to this are, of course, obvious. Lastly, we can adopt a Berkeleyan view of phenomena. For Berkeley held that not merely the unrepresented, but the representations as such, are sustained by God, in the absence of human beings. This involves the, for me, too difficult corollary that out of all the wide variety of collective representations which are found even today over the face of the earth, and the still wider variety which history unrolls before us, God has chosen for his delight the particular set of collective representations shared by Western man in the last few centuries. It does not, of course, necessarily follow that all the descriptions of prehistory are absurd. Even if the usual way of recording what, in the absence of man, was going on in the unrepresented must be criticized as a dubious extrapolation, the descriptions may still, as I have suggested, be valuable, not as actual descriptions, but as notional models. What is important is to remember that that is all they are. Especially will this be the case if we should ever have to assess the merits of this approach against those of any other possible way of acquiring knowledge of the prehistoric past. For the nature of these descriptions is that of artificial imagery, and when the nature and limitations of artificial images are forgotten, they become idols. It is, however, not only these purely theoretical or academic idols with which this book is concerned.